goal set in the country, and that needs to be significantly enhanced. One of the questions that are consistently asked by early childhood activists over the years has been, why is there no ECD legislation? Government, through the National Department of Education, has not had ECD legislation in its plans. No one has turned policy into legislation. And the reason for this, I'm told by key informants, is that the minute you legislate, for example, for early childhood development to be compulsory or grade R, government is then under an obligation to provide it. And if government fails to provide, they place themselves at risk of litigation. And I think this is a reflection of the low policy priority, that the low political priority that ECD has had over the years and enjoyed from government. The next point I want to mention is about the role of the National Treasury in early childhood development. The National Treasury is critical in providing funds for ECD delivery. Prior to 2001, there was no mention of National Treasury in any of the policy documents. The National Treasury was also not part of the interim policy for ECD, although it did play a role in the writing of Education White Paper 5. It's only when we came to the National Integrated ECD Policy that we see that National Treasury was part of the Social Development Steering Team that developed that policy. If we look at the ECD nonprofit sector, the nonprofit sector was very involved in policy making and program delivery, certainly up to about the year 2000. But after that, government went on a track where, rather than using the expertise in the nonprofit sector, it employed ECD consultants and expert teams to develop ECD policy. For example, the National Integrated ECD Policy was developed by an expert team put together by the Human Sciences Research Council. And they did a really excellent job. I want to reflect a bit on the current state of ECD in South Africa as at September 2022. We've come a long way, from the apartheid years when only white children were beneficiaries of early childhood subsidies and early childhood opportunities. We now have a system where all children potentially can benefit. We've come a long way in that we've taken early childhood development not only as education, preschool, kindergarten, but it's far more integrated and comprehensive, including health, nutrition, social protection, child well-being. These are all very, very positive moves. However, when Owen van der Berg and Tanya Vegnani described ECD as fragmented, inadequate, and unequal more than 3 decades ago, that is still the case. If we look at who is in an ECD center or in an ECD program, it's middle class and privileged children who are benefiting far more than children in poverty and in rural areas. So whilst racial discrimination has disappeared, inequality in ECD provision still exists. And children who would previously have been classified as not being white are still the least provided for with inferior quality services. On the positive side, the ECD workforce, the qualifications and the capacity has improved significantly over the years. And most of that training is because of the nonprofit sector, and more recently by the vocational training colleges. We have before us at the moment the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, and this is intended to clear up the confusion around grade R. You know, the word, if you look at Education White Paper 5, there's nothing about grade R being compulsory. The word used is universal. With the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, we're going to get some clarity that grade R is going to be made compulsory. And that's for children 4 turning 5 or 5 turning 6, depending on what the legislature decides. So there has been advances in early childhood development over the years. There are, however, 5 main challenges that still exist. The first is that there is no political will of the South African government to implement the National Integrated ECD policy to any significant degree. In the policy, there are 3 timeframes that are set: 2017, 2024, and 2030. Almost every requirement for 2017 has been missed and has not been achieved. And I think part of the problem here is that ECD is not a political priority. And because it's not a political priority, it will not be adequately funded and thus implemented in South Africa. The next challenge is that we need a political champion who will lead the political process around ECD. This worked wonderfully in Chile, where the president, Michelle Bachelet, she was the political champion. She took ECD into her presidency. We need the president of our country to take ECD into the presidency in some form or shape. The third challenge is that we need competent public officials managing ECD. We have some around the country, but far too few. We have to remedy the lack of managerial expertise and skills within implementing government departments. The fourth challenge is to ensure the funding for ECD, for health, and for nutrition programs. Still, less than 2% of our expenditure on education goes to early childhood development, and this is untenable. And the last challenge is that we need to build the ECD nonprofit and community capacity. For me, the future is at a community level, and we've seen it in recent protest action and activism, where community ECD teachers and activists came out in tens of thousands to protest against the abuse of the ECD stimulus package. So we've come a long way, but we still have a longer way to go. And it is occasions like this where we look back and see what could we have done better that informs us as we go forward. Reader one, with that, I would conclude, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions or disagreements. My final comment is we have to keep going. It can be disheartening, it can be difficult. There are days when you ask yourself, why are we still doing this? You know, when we see hundreds of billions of rand being corrupted, and we see the ECD subsidy at 17 rand per child per day, and if parents earn more than 3,800 rand a month, they're considered too affluent. We have to keep going. And with the colleagues and the comrades and the cadre that we've got on this webinar, we can do it and we will do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Eric Atmore. I want to also just say to everyone on the webinar that the notes that Professor Eric Atmore has spoken from will be made available, and we'll share with everyone that have registered, and it will also be available on the CECD website and also on the FCW website. We're going to allow for people to pose some questions. You know, people can raise their hands if they have questions. And I see in the chat, Guy Harris have asked a few questions. So I'm just going to run through it, Eric. So what Guy is asking or saying is that ECD beneficiaries don't have the vote and can't protest at the gates of Parliament. How do we move from, or how do we move rapidly from policy to action? And secondly, he's also asking, how do we take ECD budgets from the back of the Treasury queue to the front? And then thirdly, the question is the impact of fetal alcohol syndrome on ECD learners, and how can we get the alcohol value chain to make good for irresponsible drinking? If there's any other questions, but maybe Eric, if you want to respond to the first three questions that came from Guy Harris.
Guy, good afternoon. I think, you know, it's only through activism, and there was a period of about 20 years from 2000 to 2020 when the sector went quiet. And I think part of that was we gave government a honeymoon period where we let them get on with the task, but they did not deliver. Subsequent to the Minister of Social Development not opening ECD centers when schools went back, the community ECD sector came out in their tens of thousands onto the streets. And I think we need to keep that momentum. There are initiatives around activism. We're starting to meet with politicians, political parties, mayors of cities, premiers around early childhood development. But you know, we need to keep chipping away. It's difficult, it's tough, and often we think it's not working. One of my colleagues met with the mayor of Cape Town the other evening. We've met with various MMCs and so on. The CEO of FNB, Jacques Zelier, he's come to the party quite big. And I spoke with him and Premier Alan Winde on a platform to business people about 4 months ago. It's that constant activism. The disappointment is that many ECD non-profits are reluctant to be activists. The reason being that they fear that their donors will take their money away or that government would clamp down on them. We have to be brave and we have to keep up that activism. On ECD budgets, again, the pressure has to come from below, where parents in communities, in wards, speak to their councillors, speak to their MPs, and that budget has to grow to at least 5 to 8% of educational expenditure. It's shocking that the ECD budget is still 17 Rand per child per day, whilst the Minister of Justice tells us that it costs 400 Rand per day to keep each prisoner in prison. That is something like a 32-fold increase over the ECD subsidy. The question of fetal alcohol syndrome, again, we have to get those wine producers, those alcohol producers on board and see the damage that they're doing. But that will only come about when there's activism. And I think our activism, we have to take a step up. We have to be more militant. We have to be more, you know, if you look at the taxi industry, not a good analogy, but they get things done. If you look at students, fees must fall. Not a good analogy, but they get things done. Suddenly, Jacob Zuma pulled 12 billion rand out of his back pocket when fees must fall marched on the union buildings. So it's a long battle, and we have to get everybody involved. And I think we'll get there, but we'll keep chipping away.
Prof, there's one more question from Juliana Bland. She's asking that you speak to the financial contribution that parents are making, and I think she's really saying that this is a highlight. It's important that you highlight this important contribution. I think in your presentation you referred to the 10.2 billion that parents are contributing. I think it will help if you maybe just speak a little bit more about parents' commitment to the ECD sector.
Ridwan, parents are funding ECD in this country. How I got to that figure was to look at the recent census. The census tells us that there's 1.66 million children enrolled. The census tells us that the average fee per child is 509 Rand per month, and they're 12 months in the year. If you calculate that, you come to just over 10 billion. It's around about 10.2 billion. And that's part of the contribution to the economy. So we're not a Mickey Mouse sector. We're a huge sector contributing 10 billion Rand. I think we need to get that across. And Juliana is right. Parents are taxpayers. Parents are voters. They've got the power to effect change, whether we do it at local level with our councillors, whether we do it at provincial level with our MECs and members of the provincial legislature, or whether we do it with our National Assembly. There are 400 politicians sitting there. If each of us on this webinar spoke to 4 MPs, we'll reach every single MP in Parliament. But it's, you know, there's no quick fix. We've come from one really bad environment and we're getting there. But I think Juliana Bland is quite right. It's through the parent body, parents as a collective, that we are going to get, that we can unleash a whole additional form of activism.
Thanks, Prof, for sharing that. And I think it's also very important to, like you say, or rightfully say, that through activism, we have to highlight the parents' contribution and families' contribution to sustain and drive the early childhood development sector. And I think it's important that we, through the activism and through the advocacy that we do, having to say to government, if parents' contribution is more than 5% more of what, or 5 times more than what government's currently contributing, then we have to get government to work towards matching parents' contributions to early childhood development. There's one other question in the chat. I'm a private ECD provider for underprivileged children, and we are struggling with fundraising to be able to supply the equipment that is needed. The money we do get, we feed the children. how will I go about fundraising from others over and above what we are already doing? Yeah, one of those struggling ECD NGOs that's at the coalface.
The person asking the question says that she's a private provider. That implies that she's not a non-profit, and she's then disqualified from getting government funding. That angers me because government is bailing out SAA, it's bailing out ESCOM, it's bailing out Denel, and it's bailing out VBS Bank. And those are all private initiatives. So that's at a higher political level, that there's no reason why a small provider who is private cannot get support. After all, nobody takes or gets involved in ECD to become a multimillionaire. If anything, they're using of their family's resources to provide for those children. But there are ways. In every community, there's a local spaza shop. There's a local business. And there are bigger funders who fund ECD center operating costs. They're few and far between, but they are there. You know, we look at some of the funders who provide food, Tiger Brands, Do More Foundation, Peninsula School Feeding Scheme. There are all sorts of ways, but it's not easy. It's really tough. And it's an indictment on us, on our government, and on our society, that those who need it most have to struggle the hardest.
Right. Thanks for sharing that, Prof. Are there any other questions from the participants? Anyone with a question or burning issue, please raise your hand. Click on the icon below, and we'll try and get your mute and unmute button to work. Are there any hands? Any additional comments? 1 second. Lizette, she's saying thanks for a stimulating presentation. What's your opinion on the move to DBE and whether this could pave the way for addressing the persistent systemic barriers and challenges that you've mentioned? Thanks, Lizette.
Lizette, good afternoon. And you would recognize that you were one of the key informants that I interviewed for this study probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And thank you for your contribution over the years. You're a warrior for children's rights. The move is long overdue. If you look at the NEPI, National Education Policy Investigation, we recommended that early childhood development be located within education. If you look at the South African preschool study, which Linda and Renee King and others are on this webinar, we recommended that it fall under education. And I think it was a bad decision for us to locate it under social development. And it's an excellent decision to locate it under basic education nationally and education in the provinces. Already, I'm not so up to date on the other provinces, but in this province, we've already got a really good partnership going with the Western Cape Education Department on the rollout of ECD. So I think it's long overdue, and I think we'll feel the benefits. We'll see the benefits years down the line, but we have to get that budget changed. We cannot continue with a few billion here and a few billion there. It has to be a significant injection into the public sector through the budget. In the light of that, we're trying to get a meeting with the finance minister. As an aside, when all this activism was going on a few months ago, I got a WhatsApp from Trevor Manuel, the former finance minister, saying, keep going at it, make them allocate the money. And I WhatsApped him back saying, where were you when we asked you? So we have to get the finance minister to realize. I understand that there are gatekeepers in National Treasury, but we have to bulldoze our way through that. And we can only do it through people's power and through activism.
Great stuff. Eric, we have about 2 minutes before we hit the 3 o'clock cutoff. Are there any other questions or comments? If you haven't posted anything in the chat box or on the Q&A, please raise your hand and we'll see if we can accommodate 1 or 2 more questions. Christine Waldy from the Free State. Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation. The struggle for adequate all-round recognition of ECD is ongoing. That's true. And Karima Jacobs, how can the Western Cape's Children Commissioner play a role in ensuring that all our children receive funding? Any thoughts on that, Prof?
Karima, I've told the Western Cape Children's Commissioner that she must put more focus on policy and on programmatic matters. She's had a really good focus on child matters. She's getting children involved. There's a children's parliament. She's got child advocates. But I've said to her, she also has to do the hard work with the Premier, with the MECs, and with the mayors of all the towns in the province. So we are on her case in a nice way. And I think the other 8 provinces, if there are people on this webinar from the other 8 provinces, lobby for a children's commissioner in your province. The Western Cape has a model. There's a piece of legislation which introduces a children's commissioner, but there should be one in every single province.
Sorry, I'm speaking to myself. We have 2 hands that's raised, Professor Asina Ibrahim and Michelle Solomon. Professor Asina, can you go? Just trying to check where's your mute. Are you able to speak?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much for such a vibrant discussion on going forward. I joined late, so pardon me. What I wanted to find out is that, when these negotiations happens for ECD programs or policies and so forth, why is it that we don't have the Treasury represented around the table? Because then you can also look at, whatever you're proposing from the idea of what percentage of, the budget this would require. And overall, how does that compare to what is being touted as the, an entry point for GDP expenditure on early childhood? I think that this financing bit comes up all the time, and if we don't get those kinds of things right, that's really the thing going to be problematic. So I'd like to hear what Eric has to say about Treasury around the table for programs. And then my second comment is that I really would like to thank platforms like this that shows that the advocacy has to be strong to show the way. And showing the way comes through the experiences on the ground, despite all the evidence and what have you, but the experiences on the ground are really what we have to talk to. So keep going, Eric, and thank you very much for platforms like this.
Thanks. Prof, just before you go, can we get Michelle Solomon to also share her contribution? Anis, are we unmuting her?
Hi, Mr. Ali.
Hi there.
No, it's okay, Mr. Ali. I got my answer.
All right. Okay. No problem.
Sure.
Okay. Prof, back to you.
Hasina, as I know you, you've hit the nail on the head. You know, you haven't beaten around the bush. You haven't played games. You've hit the nail on the head. It is all about Treasury making the funding available. Up until 2013, 2014, just before the National Integrated ECD policy, Treasury had nothing to do with, or little to do with ECD policies. They did come on board and they were part of the team that developed the 2015 National Integrated ECD policy. We have to get to them, and that should be a goal for all of us, for those involved in advocacy, to get to the minister and to get to the DG. What you've taught me is make that call today, send that email today requesting that meeting, and we will do it. We did have a wonderful guy in the Treasury called Mark Belcher, and he was really helpful. But we need to get to the decision makers and get them to see the economic return. You know, I'm increasingly understanding that it's the economic benefits that will change government and make them be more proactive and more supportive of ECD. And then your second comment, yes, it is on the ground, the lived experience of those ECD teachers, those ECD workers, and we have to mobilize them. There is talk about a union for ECD teachers and ECD workers, but both your points are right the nail on the head.
I say mandla to that, Prof. I think one other question here is, how can we enforce ECD if there's not even a mention of ECD in the IDP? This comes from Hulda.
Look, IDPs are done at municipal level, districts, and so on. Every one of us has the democratic right to contribute to that IDP. And it's a matter of not knocking on doors, but banging doors down. We're only going to get action if we are firm, if we are strong, and if we take all these opportunities that present themselves. So my advice would be, get hold of your district municipality or your metropolitan local authority and educate them, inform them, guide them on what they should be doing for young children, because often they're not even aware that there's an issue.
One last question. If government can fund 350 for unemployed people, this contribution really says that government should then give that money to ECD. Your thoughts?
Look, that's a very difficult one. It's not only children who are suffering and who are in poverty, adults are as well, young people, the unemployed. I would be very reluctant to take money from poor people to fund ECD. There is so much wastage in this country. There's so much money. Remember, we are a middle income country in terms of the United Nations. If we just look at the wastage and the theft and the corruption, we could ensure that every child has a quality program in a decent building, fully equipped with a trained teacher. So I don't think the answer is to take from one vulnerable group and move it onto another vulnerable group. I think the cake is big enough. We are not a poor country. We just need to spend our money more wisely. Why are we sending 50 million rand in cash to Cuba when we could put that 50 million into ECD? That brings up the president's 1.3 billion rand ECD stimulus package, of which less than 300 million has been spent and about 800 million has gone back to National Treasury. That money is needed in the sector. We are about to launch a constitutional challenge, litigation around that stimulus package. How dare they lose 800 million, 712 million taken back by National Treasury, and 70 million that was rolled over was taken back. That's just on 800 million. That's where we must take that money from, not from the 350 rand, what do you call it, unemployed grant.
Right. Thanks very much, Prof, for responding to some of the questions and your contributions this afternoon. There's no other hands and no other comments coming through. Yes, I think the last one is really saying that thank you for the presentation. Our WIS government has money but not prioritizing ECD. I think that that's the essence of Professor Eric Atmore's contribution this afternoon, focusing on the importance of early childhood development and the policy processes that has unfolded over the last 30 years. And unfortunately, although we know from the literature and the research that investment in early childhood development is crucial to take families and individuals out of the poverty downward spiral, I think it's also important that we acknowledge in the one question that was raised and the comment that was made around parents contributing 10.2 billion, 5 times more than what government is currently investing and contributing towards early childhood development. So yes, we know that ECD is not a priority. It's on the back burner, and I think Professor Eric Atmore's indicated and emphasized the need for activism, the need for us to mobilize not only our parents and our communities, but also to make sure that at the IDP level, at the community level, that ward councillors start taking the services that are being provided and offered in their community through ECD service providers, that their issues are placed on the agenda and prioritized at the community and ward level. So yes, we all have a collective responsibility to make sure that we drive forward the issues around early childhood development. And I'm hoping that as the series unfolds, that we'll have other speakers and presenters that will comment on or speak on some of the questions that have been raised maybe from a different angle or using a different lens. So I want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. And we're looking forward, as soon as we hear from Linda Biersteek and Patsy Pillay around a date for the next webinar. And we'll share that with everyone as soon as possible. So thanks very much, everyone, for making time this afternoon. We did say we're going to keep it to 1 hour, and I'm happy that that we only went over 10 minutes. Thanks very much. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Ridwan. Thank you.
All right. So for those that are still on, if you can hear me, the session has been live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. So for those that haven't made time to watch the entire hour, please get the recording on Facebook and YouTube.